My name is Timothy Wise. I'm the Research and Policy Director at the Global Development Environment Institute, and today we're awarding the Leontief Prize for Advancing the Frontiers of Economic Thought to Michael Lipton and to Peter Timmer. And I'm pleased to be here today talking to Peter Timmer about the subject of his Leontief lecture on the global food crisis and the future of agriculture. Welcome.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
I was struck that in your Leontief lecture you noted somewhat wryly that to your quote-unquote consternation and secret delight
you read it.
that food price volatility is finally back on the intellectual and policy agenda, and the consternation is obviously understandable. Say something more about the secret delight.
I've worked much of my career trying to stabilize rice prices. I worked in Indonesia early on, straight out of my PhD, and that's where I learned about development. But I learned within the first week of arriving, not knowing anything about Indonesia or its economy, that if rice prices weren't pretty stable, there wasn't going to be a government, and then there couldn't be a development program, and people were going to stay poor. So it seemed really important to figure out how to stabilize rice prices. In Asia, rice prices equals food prices, so for 42 years now, I've spent a considerable amount of intellectual energy trying to figure out how to do that at the country level, how to cope with the fact that we cannot do it at the global level, and then dealing with that tension in between. Starting in the mid-1980s, after we get the full production response to the earlier food crisis in the early 1970s, food prices collapse, they stay low, they're remarkably stable for 2 decades. A little blip in 95, 96, but basically we had pretty stable food prices. And for somebody in my business, I'm out of business. So the secret delight is all of that work and intellectual energy is back on the agenda. As I said, people are citing my 1989 article on why should we do this, how should we do it. So in that sense, it's kind of fun. I'm back in business again.
I know you've studied over a long period of time the role that food reserves play in that process of stabilizing prices. Why is that so critical to the stabilization process?
Well, by and large, food production is an annual cycle. There are parts of Asia where it's irrigated. You can get 2 crops and sometimes even a bit more than that. But basically, you get a crop at a particular point in time, and then you consume it gradually over the year until the next crop comes. Most traditional societies have a term for the month or 2 months before the harvest comes in. It's called the hungry season. And so how much grain you store out of the harvest determines whether or not you make it through to the next harvest. So even in traditional societies without functioning governments, storage is really important. Now, when you sort of come into a more modern market economy, those storage decisions increasingly get made on commercial terms. You have to be able to make money in order to store the grain. And then how much grain there is as you come into the next harvest season determines whether or not you're going to get spikes in prices. So we spent a lot of time, I worked a lot with the Food Logistics Agency in Indonesia. We spent a lot of time trying to figure out how large their publicly owned reserves had to be to keep that spike from happening during the pre-harvest season and to make it smoothly into the harvest season. And as you can imagine, there's a whole academic debate on what the public role should be there, what the private role should be there. If you come at this from the technical side, Kansas State University has a whole program on grain storage, trying to make that an efficient operation. But without grain reserves, we are totally dependent on that crop coming when we think it's going to come. And so the grain reserves provide the buffer, the flexibility to deal with uncertainty. The larger the reserves are, the greater the uncertainty you can cope with, but the more they cost. Grain reserves are expensive to hold, especially across from year to year. You have to hold them from the harvest through just so you can run them out. But if you're trying to hold grain for multiple year periods, that's very expensive. A lot of quality deterioration, interest costs, just the whole thing. Grain reserves are expensive. Big question in the profession now is how big should they be to deal with the food volatility, price volatility that's back, and who ought to own them? That's the debate that we're having right now.
And I mean, obviously the food price spikes of 2007 and subsequently have been the alarm bell making a lot of governments and international agencies rethink the viability or the value of such costs. I know that the chief economist of the World Bank, Justin Lin, has said, well, maybe the public benefit outweighs the high cost.
I think the food crisis 07-08 caused us to rethink two different things. In the short run, it caused us to rethink the stocks, the reserves issue. We didn't value that contingent benefit of being able to prevent sharp spikes that would undermine confidence in markets and just enormous losses going forward if big countries walk away from the market and trade as a way of provisioning food rather than we have to produce everything ourselves. And that was the first and I think correct response was maybe we haven't valued stocks correctly. The second one, and I think this is where the longer run payoff is going to be, we stopped investing in agricultural research and infrastructure and technology and all of the policy environment to favor agricultural development. We basically stopped that in the 1980s and just let it deteriorate for over 2 decades. Agriculture's back on the agenda in that sense also. So we've got two different agendas moving forward now. One is how do we revitalize agricultural productivity growth? That's a big long-run question, but how do we get ourselves through the volatile environment that we're going to be facing over the next 5 or 10 years if we don't do something on the reserve side?
I know that certainly one of the conclusions from our report on the responses to the food crisis was to see that kind of re-emerging debate over the importance of food reserves, but I have to say we weren't overwhelmingly impressed that it was taking hold at the international level, although certainly at the national level in some countries, very active.
I do not think it will take hold at the international level. I think we are so spooked by the failure of the international commodity agreements of the 60s and 70s. We are captured by the Newbery and Stiglitz book on theory of commodity price stabilization, that it's impossible to stabilize prices globally for long, long periods of time. It can't be done. And we've got rubber and cocoa and coffee and wheat and sugar and a bunch of commodity agreements that just didn't pan out because you either run out of money to buy or you run out of stocks to sell in any kind of stochastic environment. Since you can't import from Mars or the moon, or when you're in a closed economy, that's true. But that has nothing whatsoever to say about whether countries can do it. And then the big question is, if countries stabilize internally and dump the instability out in the world market, there's a real loss of public you're using the commons and destroying it. And what I'm hoping we get out of the recent crisis is a willingness for the profession to ask a different question about price volatility. The standard response from the trade economists is free trade under all circumstances that will minimize volatility because you have more producers and consumers responding. When you say free trade is politically impossible in an environment of unstable markets, oh, well then I'll go home. couldn't we instead ask, aren't there second or third best options where countries can do 95% of the stabilization they want to do and only have 20% of the spillover impact in the rest of the market instead of the big impact that they're having? Is there any way we can get Asia, which generates a lot of this instability because you've got India, China, Indonesia stabilizing prices and dumping the instability on a very thin world rice market. Is there any way we could get Asia to sit down and talk about arrangements that wouldn't blow up the price of rice on poor African consumers? These are not discussions we're having yet, but I think we can get them on the agenda. And that's my sort of ulterior motive is let's see if we can't get the profession to start thinking differently. Think about stable food prices as a good rather than a bad, and automatically the question changes then.
Yeah. And it seems like, again, apart from whatever's happening at the international level or is not happening at the international level, at the national level, it seems like there's a great deal more attention to all of these issues related to food production on the one hand, and food price stabilization on the other.
The action clearly is at the national. It's not at the local level, or there's a little bit of interesting stuff going on there. The NGOs are trying to figure out how do you help poor households cope with this kind of instability. The international community, the best they can do is say, well, let's have somewhat more transparent market information. Fine, but that is not going to be the deal. I think there's a hybrid that bears watching. The ASEAN plus 3, which is the ASEAN community plus China, Japan, and South Korea, have a rice reserve scheme. I don't think that scheme's very important because they've specifically said it's not for use to stabilize prices, it's for emergencies like a tsunami. But twice a year, the leaders of these countries sit down around the table and talk about food security. It is on their agenda every time. And wouldn't it be nice if they would say, you know what, we're not going to do this as an ASEAN-owned initiative, but all of us think we ought to have 10% more rice reserves in our own countries, under our own control, but the world market will see that. We don't have to promise to deliver it as a price stabilization device. We just need the reserves to make sure that we will then be able to trust the market because we've got the reserves just in case. That will stabilize the environment, but it also has the benefit of getting countries to stop what I think are pretty crazy self-sufficiency schemes on the production side that really are hurting the poor in these countries. So if we could build confidence in trade through the use of larger reserves, I think we get both of those. We get the efficiency and the equity out of that. I think that's going to be on the agenda going forward now.
Well, thank you so much for talking with us, Peter Timmer, and congratulations on the Leontief Prize.
Thank you very much. I am really excited to be here.